Rancher, widowed, needed a wife to keep his land, but the only one left was the housekeeper, Lot 18. James McAllister had spent most of his life on the wide-open plains of Wyoming. The ranch his family had built generations ago stretched as far as the eye could see, with rolling hills, a few scattered trees, and the endless sky that seemed to go on forever. The land was harsh, demanding, and unforgiving, but James loved it more than anything else in the world. From the moment he could walk, he had learned to work the ranch with his father, tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and riding out in all kinds of weather. By the time he became an adult, James had inherited the ranch after his father passed, and it had been his responsibility ever since. Life on the ranch was never easy. Winters could be brutal with snowstorms that blocked the roads and froze the water in the troughs. Summers brought long, hot days under the sun, with dust swirling in the wind and the constant work of keeping the cattle healthy and the land productive. But James had always found comfort in the rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of a day spent outdoors, and the feeling of being connected to the land he loved. He had also found love once. His wife, Margaret's namesake, had been the joy of his life. They had married young, full of hope and plans for the future. Together they had built a home on the ranch, and she had brought warmth, laughter, and kindness that filled the quiet corners of their life. They had 2 children, who were the center of James's world. But life had a way of testing even the strongest hearts. James's wife fell ill and passed away suddenly, leaving him devastated and alone, responsible for the ranch and his children. The sorrow he felt was deep, and it seemed to settle into the very walls of the house, making even the bright mornings feel heavy. After his wife's death, James threw himself into his work. The ranch needed care, and the children needed guidance, so he had little time to dwell on his grief. He worked from sunrise to sunset, checking the fences, feeding the cattle, repairing equipment, and planning for the seasons ahead. He found some comfort in the routine, but there was always a quiet loneliness that lingered in the evenings when the chores were done and the house was silent. He missed having someone to share his thoughts with, someone to laugh with, someone who could ease the weight of responsibility he carried alone. The people in the small town nearby were kind, but there were few who could truly understand the demands of life on the ranch. Many had left for better opportunities, and those who remained were busy with their own lives. James realized that if he wanted the ranch to survive, he needed more than just himself. He needed a partner, not just for the work, but for the future of his children and the home they called their own. The only person who had always been there, quietly helping and keeping the house running, was the housekeeper, Margaret. She lived in a small cabin near the main house, on a little plot called Lot 18. Everyone in town knew her as the dependable caretaker of the ranch, the woman who had helped raise the children, cooked the meals, mended the clothes, and kept the household in order. She had been with James's family for years even before he was married, and had stayed loyal through thick and thin. She was practical, hardworking, and intelligent, and she understood the ranch in a way few people did. Margaret was not a woman who sought attention or admiration. She was quiet and humble, content to stay in the background while the family went about their lives. She knew the land, the cattle, and the routines of the house, and she took pride in her work. She also cared deeply for James's children, teaching them lessons, telling them stories, and offering comfort when they were upset or afraid. The children loved her like a family member, and James trusted her completely. But there was a complication. James had never thought of Margaret as more than a housekeeper, and she had never thought of herself as more than a helper. Their relationship had always been defined by practicality and respect. Yet, as the years passed and the challenges of running the ranch mounted, James began to notice how much he relied on Margaret. He saw her strength, her intelligence, and her unwavering dedication. Slowly, he realized that perhaps the answer to the future of his ranch and even his own happiness might be right in front of him. Still, the thought of asking Margaret to marry him made him uneasy. How would it feel to change the nature of their relationship? Would it be wrong to ask her to take on a role that combined both love and duty? And what about Margaret herself? Did she feel the same way, or would she see such a proposal as purely practical? These questions weighed heavily on James, and for a long time he did nothing. He continued his work, managing the ranch and caring for his children, while the quiet seasons passed. Margaret, for her part, noticed James's growing hesitation. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the loneliness he carried, and she felt a deep empathy for him. Yet, she also understood the boundaries that had always existed between them. She valued her independence and the sense of purpose she found in caring for the ranch, and she had never imagined stepping beyond her role as a housekeeper. She was content with her life on Lot 18, though she also felt a quiet longing for something more, a family of her own, a place where she truly belonged. Life on the ranch went on, with its predictable routines and occasional surprises. The cattle needed feeding, the fences needed mending, and the children grew a little older each day. James continued to work hard, always thinking about the future, always aware that time was not on his side. He knew the ranch could not survive on effort alone. It needed a stable, committed household to thrive. The quiet realization settled in slowly. The answer to his dilemma might not come from outside, but from someone who had already been part of his life for years. Margaret had proven her loyalty, her skill, and her compassion time and again. She understood the land, the children, and the work in a way that no one else did. The thought of asking her to become more than a housekeeper filled him with both hope and fear. Hope for the future, for the possibility of companionship, and for a secure home for his children. Fear of rejection, of changing something that had always worked, and of disrupting the delicate balance that had kept their lives together after so much loss. Despite his fears, James began to notice small signs that Margaret's feelings might be more than just professional. The way she stayed late to help the children with their lessons, the gentle concern in her eyes when he returned from a long day in the field, and the quiet moments they shared while tending the chores all hinted at a deeper connection. He could no longer ignore the possibility that she might feel the same way, that the partnership he needed could also be the partnership of the heart. It was a delicate situation, one that required careful thought and patience. James knew that rushing or forcing the issue could destroy the trust they had built over the years. He needed to find a way to show Margaret that he valued her not only as a housekeeper, but as a person who could be a partner in every sense. And Margaret, in turn, had to recognize her own feelings, her loyalty, and the potential for a life that went beyond the routines of Lot 18. As the sun set each evening over the wide plains, casting long shadows across the rolling hills, James often stood at the porch of the main house, looking out over the ranch. He thought about the future, about the challenges ahead, and about the person who had been by his side through it all. Margaret in her cabin on Lot 18 worked quietly, humming softly to herself, unaware that the moment of change was slowly approaching. In the heart of Wyoming, amidst the endless sky, the sprawling land, and the demanding work of the ranch, two lives were quietly preparing to intersect in a way that would change everything. The future of the ranch, the happiness of the family, and the course of their lives hung in the balance, waiting for the right time, the right word, and the courage to take the first step. And as the days turned into weeks, the unspoken bond between James and Margaret grew stronger, hinting at a story that was only just beginning. A story of loyalty, love, and the quiet power of human connection on the vast open plains. The months passed slowly on the McAllister Ranch, each day bringing new challenges and responsibilities. James McAllister had grown more aware than ever that running a large ranch alone was a task almost impossible to manage. Even with Margaret's quiet help in the house, the cattle needed constant attention, the fences demanded repair, and the children needed guidance and care. He felt the weight of every responsibility pressing down on him, a pressure he could not ignore. James's two children, Anna and Samuel, were bright and spirited, but they were still very young. Anna, at 10, was clever and quick-witted, always asking questions about the ranch and eager to help where she could. Samuel, a lively 7-year-old, followed his father everywhere, eager to learn but often stumbling and making mistakes that required patience and correction. The children loved their father dearly, and they missed their mother every day, though they tried to be brave and strong. James loved them with all his heart, but he also understood that they needed more than a parent's guidance. They needed a stable household, and someone who could care for them when he was busy with the ranch. Margaret had been their constant presence. She had helped the children with their lessons, prepared meals, and kept the house in order. She knew how to soothe Samuel when he was upset or frightened, and how to encourage Anna's curiosity and intelligence. She did it all quietly, without asking for recognition, and she had become almost like family to the children. Yet for Margaret, this role was both comforting and bittersweet. She loved the family deeply but understood the limits of her place. She was a housekeeper, a caretaker, but not a mother and not the companion of James, at least not in the way society expected. Still, life on the ranch made it impossible to ignore her importance. There were mornings when the chores were too many for one person, and Margaret would ride out with James to check the fences or feed the cattle. Her hands were strong from years of work, her knowledge of the land precise and practical. She knew which cattle needed extra care, which fences required reinforcement, and how to handle any sudden problem that arose. James could rely on her completely. He began to realize that she was no ordinary helper. She was someone who could manage, think, and act in a way that complemented his own strengths. Yet, despite this reliance, a tension began to grow. James found himself thinking about Margaret in ways he hadn't before. I admired her quiet strength, her patience with the children, and the way she handled difficulties with calm efficiency. But he also found himself wondering, was it possible that she could be more than a housekeeper? Could she be someone to share his life, not just the work? Margaret, meanwhile, noticed the change in James. She saw a certain hesitation in his eyes, a quiet longing that he had tried to hide. She wondered if he was considering a future in which she might play a larger role, but she also feared imagining it. She had learned to value her independence and the quiet routine of life on Lot 18. Her heart was loyal to the family she served, but she worried that taking any step beyond her current role could upset the delicate balance of their lives. The rising tension in their relationship was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet, subtle, and built slowly, like a river carving its path through rock. James struggled internally, balancing the practical needs of the ranch with the personal feelings he could no longer deny. He needed a wife to help maintain the ranch and secure its future, but he also wanted companionship, someone who could share his burdens and joys. Margaret, with her unwavering support and love for the family, seemed like the natural choice, but the thought of asking her to step into a new role filled him with fear. Gossip in the small town began to stir. People noticed that James was no longer attending social events as often, and that Margaret seemed more present in the household than ever before. Whispered conversations hinted at a potential relationship, though no one spoke openly. James paid little attention to the gossip, focusing on the work that kept the ranch running. Margaret, too, tried to ignore the rumors, keeping her attention on the tasks at hand. Yet, both could feel the subtle shift in how they viewed each other, a quiet tension that neither wanted to name aloud. One particularly trying week forced their feelings and their partnership into the open. A sudden storm swept across the plains, stronger and colder than anything they had anticipated. Snow fell in heavy sheets, coating the fields and blocking the roads. The cattle were restless and frightened, some straying too close to the fences, others trapped near the edges of the hills. Water froze in the troughs, and the family found themselves isolated with no immediate way to get help. James worked tirelessly to protect the cattle and secure the property, but he injured his leg while climbing over a fence that had been weakened by the wind. Pain shot through him, and he knew he could not continue without assistance. Margaret immediately stepped in, her calm presence and quick thinking guiding the family through the crisis. She took charge of the cattle, making sure each animal was safe and accounted for, and she tended to James with skill and care, cleaning and wrapping the injured leg while keeping the children safe and calm inside the house. During those long hours of snow and isolation, a deeper understanding emerged. James saw Margaret's dedication and bravery in a new light. She was more than a housekeeper. She was a protector, a thinker, and a partner in every sense of the word. Margaret, in turn, saw the depth of James's reliance on her and felt a quiet recognition of her own feelings. She realized that her care for him and his children had grown beyond duty, and that her heart had longed for more than a place in the house. The snowstorm forced them into moments of intimacy and trust. They shared quiet conversations by the fire, speaking of simple things at first, the weather, the cattle, the children, but gradually moving into deeper topics, hopes for the future, fears of loss, and the weight of responsibility that each carried. In those moments, they discovered that they were not alone in their feelings. There was mutual respect, affection, and a recognition that they could rely on one another in ways that went beyond practical necessity. By the time the storm passed, the ranch was safe, the cattle were secure, and James was able to walk again with Margaret's support. But the experience had changed everything. A quiet bond had formed, stronger than before, built not only on years of shared work, but on moments of true crisis, trust, and mutual understanding. Both knew that something significant was stirring between them, something that could not be ignored any longer. Yet uncertainty remained. The thought of formally acknowledging their feelings was daunting. How would they take the next step? Would their relationship change in ways that could be difficult to manage? Both were aware that crossing the boundary from employer and housekeeper to life partners would alter the dynamic of the household and the ranch, but neither could deny that the feelings were real and growing, nurtured by years of shared labor, trust, and quiet companionship. As the days turned into weeks, James and Margaret continued their work, but with a new awareness. Small gestures carried more meaning. A touch on the shoulder, a shared smile, a knowing look across the kitchen. The children noticed the closeness, but were too young to fully understand it. The ranch itself became a stage for their growing partnership, each day a reminder that survival depended not only on hard work, but on trust, cooperation, and care for one another. By the time spring arrived, with its longer days and warmer temperatures, James understood that the solution to his dilemma had been with him all along. The woman who had supported his family, loved the children, and kept the ranch running was also the woman who could share his life, not just in practical terms, but in matters of the heart. Margaret had proven her courage, her intelligence, and her loyalty, not as an employee, but as a partner capable of standing beside him in every challenge. The rising conflict, the tension of unspoken feelings, the challenge of survival on the ranch, and the pressures of societal expectations, both James and Margaret sensed that their lives were on the cusp of a new chapter, one that would combine their history, their responsibilities, and their growing affection into a bond that could endure the trials ahead. They had faced storms, both literal and emotional, and had emerged with a clearer understanding of their connection. The next steps would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to embrace a future neither had fully imagined, but both now secretly hoped for. In the quiet moments of the evening, when the sun dipped low over the plains and the sky turned shades of golden rose, James would look toward Lot 18 and see Margaret moving about her cabin tending to the children or preparing for the next day. A sense of gratitude and admiration filled him, and he realized that the answer to the challenges he faced was not just survival, but partnership, trust, and love. Margaret, too, would glance toward the main house, feeling a warmth she could no longer ignore, a feeling that suggested their story was far from over, and that the journey they were on together was only beginning. Spring had come to the McAllister ranch, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The snow had melted, the earth smelled fresh, and the fields began to turn green. James McAllister felt the change in the air, too. There was a subtle shift in the rhythm of the ranch, in the way the cattle moved, and in the energy of the children as they played outside. Yet beneath the beauty of the season, James could feel a tension rising inside himself. He'd begun to see Margaret in a new light, realizing more and more that her presence was not just helpful, it was essential. Not only had she kept the household running through the harsh winter, but she had also quietly held the family together when it seemed that the weight of life might be too much to bear. Margaret, for her part, felt the same awareness. She had always taken pride in her work and loyalty, but now she could not deny the feelings that were growing inside her heart. She cared deeply for James and the children, and the thought of a future where she was more than a housekeeper began to feel natural. Yet fear and uncertainty held her back. She worried about what the children might think, about how the neighbors would react, and about changing the life she had always known. She had spent years in a role that was safe, predictable, and respected, and stepping beyond it was a leap into the unknown. The ranch itself presented challenges that neither could ignore. The spring thaw brought new dangers, streams running fast with melted snow, mud-soaked fields, and cattle that were restless and harder to manage. One morning, James rode out to inspect the farthest fences, while Margaret stayed to manage the children and the livestock near the house. But before he could finish, a loud, panicked bellow came from the fields. One of the young cows had slipped into a muddy ditch and could not climb out. James raced toward the scene, but the ground was slippery, and he knew he could not reach the struggling animal alone. Margaret, noticing the trouble from the house, ran out to help. Together they worked carefully, securing ropes and guiding the frightened cow back onto solid ground. The effort was exhausting, leaving both muddy, tired, and sweaty. But it was a small victory that highlighted their ability to work as a team. In moments like these, it became impossible for either of them to ignore the growing bond that had formed between them over years of shared responsibility. That evening, as they sat by the fire drying off and sharing a simple meal, James felt a surge of emotion he could no longer contain. He realized that he needed Margaret not just for her skill and dedication, but because she had become the center of his world in a way he had not expected. She had quietly become his partner in every sense, even if they had not spoken the words that would officially define their relationship. He watched her as she tended to the children, her patience and warmth shining in the soft light of the fire. His heart swelled with admiration and affection, and he wondered how he could ever tell her how he truly felt. Margaret sensed the change in James as well. She noticed the small gestures, the way he would pause to watch her work, the soft tone of his voice when speaking to the children, and the rare, thoughtful smiles he reserved only for her. She began to hope that perhaps he, too, felt the same pull towards something deeper. Still, she hesitated, unsure of how to act on her feelings without disrupting the life they had carefully built together. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of ranch life continued. Planting began in the small fields they kept for feed, fences were repaired, and the cattle were carefully tended. The children learned to ride and help with chores, their laughter ringing across the plains and bringing joy to both James and Margaret. Yet beneath the routine, an unspoken question hovered between them. When and how would they address the growing feelings that had become impossible to ignore? The turning point came during a particularly challenging day. A sudden storm rolled in unexpectedly, bringing strong winds and heavy rain. The cattle were restless, and the children were frightened by the howling wind and flashing lightning. James and Margaret sprang into action. Margaret gathered the children inside the main house, calming their fears with gentle words and careful attention, while James went out to secure the livestock and protect the fences from damage. Hours passed and the storm only grew stronger. James slipped on the wet ground while checking the back pasture, injuring his leg once again. Margaret, realizing that he could not manage alone, braved the rain and wind to find him. She guided him carefully back to the house, supporting him through the mud and water, and tended to his injury with skill and patience. In that moment, James saw more clearly than ever that Margaret was not only his helper, she was his partner, his equal, and the person he could rely on in any crisis. That night, as the storm raged outside, James and Margaret sat together by the fire, exhausted but safe. The children were asleep, and the house was quiet except for the sound of the wind against the walls. In the warmth of the firelight, they finally spoke openly about their feelings. James admitted that he had grown to rely on Margaret in ways that went far beyond the practical, and that he could no longer imagine a future without her by his side. Margaret in turn revealed her own feelings, acknowledging that her heart had long belonged not just to the family she served, but to James himself. It was a moment of honesty and trust that changed everything. The tension and uncertainty that had built over months melted away, replaced by a quiet understanding and a sense of hope. They realized that their partnership could be both practical and emotional, that love and responsibility could coexist, and that together they could face any challenge that came their way. In the days that followed, James and Margaret began to adjust to this new understanding of their relationship. Small gestures of affection became more common, and their teamwork on the ranch grew even stronger. They planned the future together, discussing how to manage the ranch, care for the children, and build a life that honored both their love and their responsibilities. The bond that had been forged in hardship and shared effort now blossomed into something deeper, a partnership that was both practical and profoundly personal. Yet, life on the ranch continued to test them. The spring brought new challenges: broken fences, sick livestock, and the constant pressure of maintaining the land. Each obstacle required cooperation, problem-solving, and endurance, but James and Margaret faced each difficulty together, supporting one another and demonstrating that their partnership was not just emotional, it was essential to the survival of the ranch and the well-being of the family. Even the children began to sense the change. Anna noticed the small smiles shared between her father and Margaret, and Samuel began to follow her example, showing care and respect in subtle ways. The household, once bound by routine and duty, now had a warmth and closeness that had been missing since their mother's passing. Laughter returned to the house, and the ranch felt alive with a renewed energy. By the end of the season, James and Margaret had both grown in understanding and confidence. They recognized that their relationship was no longer defined solely by roles of employer and housekeeper, but by trust, affection, and shared responsibility. They had faced storms, literal and emotional, and had emerged stronger and more united. Their partnership had become the foundation upon which the ranch and the family would thrive in the years to come. The turning point, born of crisis, trust, and quiet reflection, had reshaped their lives. They now saw a future together, one filled with challenges, love, and the steady rhythm of ranch life. James realized that he no longer had to face the difficulties of life alone, and Margaret understood that she could be both a partner and a beloved member of the family she had served for so long. Together they were ready to embrace the future, knowing that their bond was strong enough to withstand whatever hardships might come. As the sun set on the wide plains, casting golden light over the fields and hills, James and Margaret stood side by side, watching the cattle graze peacefully. They did not speak, for words were unnecessary. Their shared understanding, their growing love, and their commitment to each other and the family were enough. The turning point had arrived, and with it the promise of a life built on trust, care, and unwavering partnership. The spring days on the McAllister Ranch grew longer and warmer, and the land seemed to stretch endlessly under the bright open sky. After the storm, life returned to its usual rhythm, but something had shifted between James and Margaret. The quiet understanding that had emerged during the snowstorm now began to grow into a deeper, unspoken connection. Each day brought them closer, not just as partners in running the ranch, but as two people who could imagine a shared life beyond work, chores, and duty. James spent his mornings riding the fields, checking on fences and tending to the cattle. Margaret stayed busy with the children, cooking, cleaning, and preparing the household for each new day. Yet, every task they performed carried a new sense of meaning. A touch of the hand as they passed in the barn, a shared glance across the room, a gentle word to encourage or correct the children. Each small action now held a weight that had not been there before. It was a quiet dance of familiarity and affection, growing steadily in the warmth of the season. One morning, James realized the ranch faced a serious challenge. A neighboring landowner had begun to expand his operations, and there were rumors that he might try to buy or claim part of the McAllister land. James knew that securing the ranch legally and financially was now more important than ever. He needed a stable household, someone who could help him manage both the land and the family. But more than that, he needed Margaret, the one person who had proven herself time and again in the most difficult situations. She understood the land, the cattle, and the family better than anyone else. She was indispensable. For Margaret, the realization was mutual. She had spent years quietly serving the family, but now she saw that her life could be more than the duties of a housekeeper. She could be a partner, a companion, and someone who shared in both the burdens and joys of the McAllister Ranch. The thought of stepping into this new role was both exciting and terrifying. She had grown comfortable in her independence, yet the idea of a shared life with James offered a future filled with love, security, and purpose that she had never imagined. The opportunity to confront their feelings came sooner than expected. One afternoon, James received a letter from the bank, a formal notice reminding him that the ranch could face foreclosure unless ownership and household arrangements were legally secured. The letter was a shock. It reminded him that, despite years of hard work, the survival of the ranch was not guaranteed. He knew immediately what needed to be done. He could not continue alone. He could not manage the ranch and care for the children without a committed partner. And in his heart, he knew there was only one person who could fill that role. That evening, after the children were asleep, James approached Margaret at Lot 18. The small cabin looked quiet and simple under the setting sun, but inside it carried a warmth and comfort that James had come to rely on. Margaret greeted him with her usual calm and gentle smile, unaware that tonight would change everything. He took a deep breath, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. It was one thing to recognize his feelings. It was another entirely to speak them aloud. "Margaret," he began, his voice steady but soft, "there's something I need to ask you. Something important. I can't do this ranch alone anymore. I can't do this life alone. And I don't want to." He paused, searching her eyes for a sign of understanding. "I need someone by my side, not just to help with the work, but to share the life we've built here. I want you to be that person, if you'll have me." Margaret felt her heart leap. She had longed to hear these words, but had never allowed herself to hope that they would come. She stepped closer, her eyes shining with emotion. "James," she said softly, I've always cared for you. I've always wanted to help, to protect this family and this land. But I never knew if you felt the same. I never wanted to overstep my place." He reached for her hand, gripping it firmly but gently. "You've never overstepped. You've always been exactly what I needed. I can't imagine life without you. I want you not just as the caretaker of Lot 18, not just as the children's protector, but as my wife, my partner in everything." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She had spent so long suppressing her own feelings, fearing the change and the unknown. But hearing James speak openly, honestly, and with such conviction, she realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for all her life. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling. "I'll be your partner. I'll be here with you, for everything." The relief and joy that swept over James was profound. He embraced Margaret, holding her close in the soft glow of the cabin's firelight. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of completeness, a sense that the future, though still filled with challenges, would be faced together. The children, who had been peeking curiously from the doorway, understood in their own quiet way that something had changed. The warmth in the room was not just from the fire. It was from love, trust, and a promise of shared life. Over the following weeks, preparations began for a simple, heartfelt ceremony. In the small town nearby, neighbors offered congratulations and support. The children were eager and excited, helping with small tasks like folding napkins, choosing flowers, and picking out decorations for the celebration. It was not a grand event, but it was perfect in its intimacy, reflecting the lives James and Margaret had built together. Every detail, from the flowers picked from the field to the homemade cake, carried meaning, love, and care. On the day of the wedding, the ranch was alive with a quiet excitement. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the wide plains seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Friends and neighbors gathered, offering warm smiles and congratulations. James and Margaret stood together in front of the small gathering, holding hands and sharing a glance that spoke of years of shared hardship, love, and commitment. The ceremony was simple but profound. Vows were spoken not just in words, but through the understanding and trust that had been built over years of partnership. James promised to care for Margaret, the children, and the ranch with all his heart, and Margaret promised the same. They pledged not only love but cooperation, respect, and unwavering support for one another. The small crowd witnessed not just a marriage, but the union of two lives that had already been intertwined through shared experience and devotion. After the ceremony, the celebration was humble but joyous. Children ran across the fields laughing and playing, while neighbors shared stories and laughter. James and Margaret took a moment to walk together across the ranch, hand in hand, feeling the strength of their bond and the promise of their future. They knew that life would still bring challenges, harsh weather, demanding work, and the ever-present responsibilities of running a ranch, but now they would face them together. That evening, as the sun set over the wide Wyoming plains, James and Margaret sat together on the porch of the main house. The children were asleep, and the ranch was quiet, bathed in golden light. James took Margaret's hand in his, feeling the warmth, strength, and trust that had grown between them. "We've made it," he said softly. "Together, we can handle anything." Margaret smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered, "together." The wind blew gently across the fields, carrying the scent of grass, earth, and the life they had built. The ranch was safe, the family was together, and a future that had once seemed uncertain now held promise, stability, and love. The climax of their story, the moment when years of shared work, trust, and quiet affection turned into an unbreakable bond, was complete. James had asked Margaret to share his life, and she had answered with her heart. They had faced storms, hardship, and uncertainty, and had emerged stronger, united, and ready to face whatever the future might hold. In the days that followed, the routine of the ranch resumed, but everything had changed. Every chore, every meal, every ride across the fields was now imbued with a sense of shared purpose. The children flourished in the warmth and stability of a home where love was present, and the ranch prospered under the careful attention of two people committed to its future. James and Margaret's story, once defined by duty and loyalty, was now defined by partnership, trust, and love. The climax of their journey, the moment when fear and hesitation gave way to courage and honesty, had set the foundation for a life that would endure. They knew that challenges would continue to come, but together there was nothing they could not face. The McAllister Ranch, once merely a place of work and survival, had become a home. Odd 18 and the main house, once separate, now symbolized unity, warmth, and the promise of a shared life. James and Margaret had built something more than a marriage. They had built a partnership, a family, and a future filled with hope, love, and the quiet joy of two people who had found each other in the vast open plains of Wyoming.